Hello, and welcome back to my channel where I like to recommend books, review books, and also research them to figure out the stories behind them, no matter how dark they are. So if you like historical fiction, nonfiction, or true crime, or you're just a curious person like me, definitely subscribe to my channel. First, I like to talk about the book that actually got me going down this rabbit hole, Molokai. Now, those of you that have read it, I'm sure you know what road I went down, but for those of you that have not read Moloka'i, which is a fantastic book, this is about Moloka'i, an island that was used in the 20th century and 19th century to separate leprosy people from the general population. This story specifically follows a young girl in the early 20th century who unfortunately developed leprosy, and at the time it was not very well known what the disease contained. So she was taken away from her family, sent on a ship to a completely different island to live out the rest of her life and what it was like to live on Molokai during this time. Fantastic read. I've recommended this to so many people, so it is a fantastic book. I've always wanted to research this subject as far as leprosy goes, of like where it started, what it's like today, and the in-between. So during my research, I found quite a lot of things that I want to go over. So I'm going to start at the beginning, or the most earliest thing that we know about leprosy, the disease. So the oldest dated person, or I guess you can say skeleton, they found was from India of about 4,000 years ago. However, leprosy is known to have been around for a lot longer than that, because in the Bible it also mentions leprosy during that time. So it's obviously been around for many, 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 many years. So what is leprosy? Leprosy is a bacterial infection of Mycobacterium leprae, I believe is how you pronounce it. And it is actually spread through sneezing, so nasal drippage. So it's actually kind of deemed that it's not very highly contagious. So it's kind of crazy how fast it spread. Now, I'm sure we all know about kind of like the symptoms and stuff, but obviously it caused blisters, deformation, loss of color, ulcers, pain in joints. It wreaked havoc on the body. One fun fact that I learned while researching this is that actually armadillos actually carry leprosy. Didn't know that. Now, the skeleton that was found in India kind of goes along with what scientists have found, that they believe that this actually started in India. However, by the year 1200, there was already 19,000 hospitals all across Europe for leprosy. They also created something called a Lazar house, which is like a shack, if you will, outside of city gates and stuff like that, that was mainly ran by nuns and monks to take care of the sick. The most famous person to ever get leprosy at the time was actually the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV. He was actually called the Leper King, which leper is a derogatory term to describe these people. The weird thing about it is that it started to decline in the 1400s, and no one really knows why it did that. Some people believe that, the living conditions had improved, sanitation had improved, but another theory is that actually that tuberculosis was on the rise, and tuberculosis and leprosy carry a lot of the same germs. So a lot of people believe that people started building a resistance to leprosy. So by the 1600s, it had almost completely died out in Europe. However, it was still kind of prevalent in the Americas, because during this time, the African slave trade, which brought a lot of people in that carried leprosy. And of course, there wasn't a lot known about it, and I'm sure we all are aware now of how pandemics start and how fear and misinformation gets spread. So a lot of these people, especially in America, they created a lot of quote-unquote sanatoriums for these people. Now, by the 1800s is when it really started having a breakthrough as far as what leprosy was and how to treat it and what spread it. Sneezing, nasal drippage. And a Norwegian physician is the one that actually discovered this. His name was Gerard Hansen. And it is actually now, leprosy is now Hansen's disease. So from here on out, I will consider it Hansen's disease. It wasn't until the actual 1940s when they finally came out with a medication that actually cured leprosy, or Hansen's disease. This medication was called Daspone. However, they realized in the 1960s that Hansen's disease was starting to build a resistance to that, so they needed to go back to the drawing board. Then in 1981, a new tried drug, if you will, there was several different medications put into one, finally became available. And this multi-drug therapy is worldwide available for everyone. So you no longer have to isolate yourself if you are diagnosed with Hansen's disease. The cure is readily available. However, even though it is readily available worldwide, there are still many, many cases, specifically in India and these rural communities that are very, very far away from any sort of medical help. And a lot of them do not seek medical help until it is too late. So there are still a lot of issues with it in those communities. They roughly guess that about maybe 20,000 cases happen a year in India alone. So now I want to talk about Hansen's disease in the US. Like I said, the US was very terrified of it, and their solution was isolation and to create sanatoriums. So being diagnosed with Hansen's disease, it was a life sentence. You were taken away from your family and everything you ever known, and you were put into these quote unquote colonies to live out the rest of your life. And you were not allowed to leave at all. You were basically, all your rights were taken away. You weren't allowed to vote. You did not get to move freely. You didn't get to see your family. You didn't get to build a family. You didn't get to raise a family. And then the children that were born in these communities were taken away as soon as they were born. However, in the 1940s, like I said, when they had found a cure, a lot of other countries had actually abolished the whole isolation thing. However, in America, that didn't really happen because there was still so much stigma behind it. So a lot of people still were stuck in these colonies. Now, as recent as 2015, 175 people were diagnosed with Hansen's disease. And the worst that would happen, because a lot of these people caught it in time, was that they would have long-lasting effects as far as like numbness. Occasionally it would cause gangrene and they would possibly have to amputate it. But other than that, there really is no deaths per US anytime recently that I could find. They believe 95% of people today are actually naturally immune to it now. So it is very, very rare to see it these days. Now I want to talk about a specific sanatorium that I actually found quite a bit of information on, and it was the Louisiana Lear Home, and it was in Carville, Louisiana. Now the US government's idea was to move these people to this sanatorium to live out the rest of their life that way. And the first out-of-state people actually arrived in 1921. And when people first moved in there, the conditions were deemed pretty deplorable. A lot of these patients lived in former slave cabins that were abandoned for a long time, were completely ran down. So there was a lot of issues there. And this also was in a place that was running rampant with malaria as well. There was actually a fence between the women's side and the men's side. The opposite sex was absolutely prohibited from interacting with each other. And because of that, when there were rules, they built actually a jail on site in case people wanted to test the waters, do that, or try to run away. Now, as soon as a new patient would arrive, they would strongly encourage the person to give up their first and last name specifically to help save their families from the embarrassment back home and the stigma, to save their family's name. Now, eventually a hospital was built on site, and it kind of changed from, separating people, isolating people, to actually starting to research and try to treat it as well. Once the cure became available, the restrictions started to lift. And in 1946, the patients were also allowed to vote again. And over time, they really started to build a community. Like, they built houses, they built services, several different things like that. They also held their own Mardi Gras festival, and they also had weddings as well, but they were not allowed to have children. Now, in the late 1990s, they actually offered the people a couple of options. You could either stay here and live the rest of your life, or you could leave the facility and get a $46,000 stipend, or you could go into a nursing home, because a lot of these people were in these colonies ever since they were at such a young age. They don't know any different. So actually, a lot of them actually chose to stay even when they could leave. I found that kind of crazy, but I guess when you don't know any different, it's very scary to go back into the real world after that. So now I want to finally talk about Moloka'i and why this book is so important and what it's based off of. So in the 1800s, Hansen's disease had reached epidemic proportions in the Hawaiian Islands, and the government was very, very fearful that this was going to eradicate the entire population. So King Kamehameha had to figure out something of what to do to save as many people as he could. So he had approved the act to prevent leprosy. So he had created something called a leprosarium in 1866, and he chose Molokai. The reason why he chose that was because it was isolated, it was hard to get to, and it was remote, and it was not very easily accessible. So they really didn't have to risk a lot of people leaving the island and trying to flee. And they also had natives that have lived there for 900 years and were able to completely sustain themselves. So they knew that Molokai could sustain life. 8,000 people in 150 years had died on this island. However, there were actually natives that were still living on the island when it was finally deemed to house all these Hansen's disease patients. They were forced to leave their homes, and their homes were given to the patients of Hansen's disease. So they had to move to a completely different peninsula or on the opposite side. So they kind of had to uproot their lives to make room for these patients. And then the move of all these patients started moving to Molokai. So the first patients to arrive was on January 6, 1866, and it was 9 men and 3 women from different Hawaiian islands. Now, in that same year, by the time October came around, there was 101 men and 41 women. And they lived in the houses that were already there by the previous people that lived there. And it was the government's intention was for these people to basically start a colony, be able to sustain themselves, farm. But it was found out pretty fast that unfortunately that was not how it was going to go, because a lot of these people were extremely sick and not very motivated, because they were taken from their homes and stuff. So a lot of them suffered great depression, had absolutely nothing to give anymore. And majority of patients died within 10 years of being on the island. And then of course the issue started becoming that there was not enough housing, there was not enough supplies, so the living conditions were not so great either to heal in, to get better in, to do anything in. And unfortunately this was the case for many years. And during this time, when it was really, really strict, family members could visit these people, but they had to visit through chicken wire, and they were completely housed in completely separate buildings. And then about 1873 is finally when things started to turn around for these people. They had built Bishop Home for girls, and then they had also built Baldwin Home for the boys. These were run by nuns and monks. And then in 1893 and 1894, there was a huge push to get the other residents completely off and away from this peninsula, get off the island. This is now going to be for all of them. Now in 1902, there was a major push to really, really get this up and running and best quality of life that they could offer by creating services, facilities, and medical care. So they were really starting to look a lot more like a town. However, in 1903, the population of the island was starting to go down. And during this time, there was about 888 patients. 541 of them were males and 347 females. And out of those numbers, 459 men and 338 women were Hawaiian. Now, the federal government of the U.S. actually built 2 different things on this island. They built the Moloka'i lighthouse, which was ran by a lighthouse keeper and his family. Now they were completely segregated from the rest of the people. And then they had also built a research place or a research hospital to help research Hansen's disease. However, there wasn't a lot of volunteers. Not a lot of people were happy about being lab rats. So unfortunately, it did not stay open for very long. It closed down. And in 1924, the population had completely reduced to about half. And then in the 1930s, they made another push to really, really improve life on there by paving roads, building actual houses, hospitals, stores, and service stations as well. They did dances, worships, they even had weddings. They had over 1,000 people actually get married on the island. But again, they were not allowed to have children, and if they did, they were forcibly removed. But then after World War II, this was around the time when finally the cure had became available, and it was brought to Hawaii in 1946. And this greatly improved the lives of many people on the island. And a lot of the restrictions started to lift, kind of like what we went through with COVID, where they started, breaking down the barriers between patients and other people and not being so isolated and having to mingle with the general population. I think we can all relate to how that feels. And then in 1969, the forced isolation was abolished. So that means the people on the island could leave if they wanted to. And I don't know how many people at that time decided to stay and how many left, but a lot of them, I do know a lot of them did choose to stay. So in 2008, the population was only 24 people. And then by 2015, there was only 6 people left. And these people were people that went to this island when they were children. They didn't know anything different, so they decided to stay even when they were free to go. So now you know as much as I do about leprosy or Hansen's disease, the start of it, how it wreaked havoc on the world, and then what it's like today. And I think a lot of us can relate to a lot of things like this because we had all gone through COVID. So it's kind of interesting that this has been going on for so many years, how many epidemics and pandemics have happened. And at the beginning, it's so scary. Nobody knows anything, and everyone tries the best that they can to figure it out and do what they think is necessary. And then in the end, it's kind of like, was it all necessary? Did we actually understand all of it? So it's kind of weird that in the 21st century, we can still relate to that. And if you have any other further information to add, you can definitely comment that below. Or if you have any suggestions of books that are somewhat related to this topic as well, or something similar, definitely comment those below as well.